traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Welcome everybody to the West Toronto HSJCC Lunch and Learn on traumatic brain injury in the criminal justice system. My name is Patricia Pagnani. I am the program manager for the Toronto Bail Program and the co-chair for the West Toronto HSJCC group. We're asking that everybody please mute yourself and turn off your video. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the session. We have an awful lot of people joining us today, so I'm going to apologize in advance. I don't believe that we'll get around to all of the questions, but if you have a burning question that's not answered, just email it to Domenica and we'll work on getting an answer for you. Also, in the chat box, you'll see a link to an evaluation. If you could just please take a moment to fill that out, that really does help us plan for future lunch and learns. And I promise it will take you no more than about a minute to complete. Okay, so the mandate of the HSJCC is to engage in cross-sectoral planning, integration, and coordination of services for the vulnerable people that we deal with in the criminal justice system. These are individuals with mental health concerns, substance abuse issues, developmental issues, cognitive issues. Okay, so it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today Dr. Catherine Wiseman-Hakes, who is an assistant clinical professor at McMaster University. And we are also very fortunate to have with us Dr. Flora Matheson, who is a research scientist at St. Michael's Hospital and associate professor at the Institute of Medical Sciences. Thank you both so very much for taking time out of your really busy schedule to be here with us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you so very much for that lovely introduction. And we're so pleased to be here today. We are here because there is an increasing recognition internationally regarding the intersection of people with brain injuries in the criminal justice system. So thank you for the introduction. I will just briefly also share that as a speech language pathologist, I represent sort of the healthcare aspect, and I look at the cognitive communication as well as the social cognition and communication impairments and challenges that are associated with brain injury that essentially become risk factors for justice involvement as well as risk factors for continued involvement. I'm also the director of the Compassionate Justice Fund, which is a nonprofit that we're going to speak about a little bit later on. And I also sit on the Downtown Human Services Justice Coordinating Committee. So I will turn it over to my colleague Flora to introduce herself, and then we'll continue.
Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So I lead the Justice and Equity Lab at MAP Center for Health Solutions at St. Michael's. I am situated at U of T as an associate professor in Dalla, Lana at the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies and Institute for Medical Sciences. And my research focus is on one of the streams is prisoner health, with more and more of my focus is on traumatic brain injury and people in the criminal justice system, looking to see, what are solutions that we can develop together as a community to assist people with traumatic brain injury coming out of the criminal justice system, and also solutions to try to prevent people from going into the criminal justice system. And I come to this from a sociological lens. I'm a sociologist, and I'm very happy to be here today. And I'm going to walk you through the learning objectives, and then Catherine's going to take over on learning objective 1. So we're going to talk today around the traumatic brain injury and the associated cognition, communication, and behavioral challenges. We're going to look to understand TBI as a risk factor for criminal justice involvement and the prevalence of it in the correctional populations. I want to talk to you a little bit today around supervision condition challenges for people with TBI and a little bit around the research we're doing in that direction. And then Catherine's going to come back and talk about how we learn strategies to support clients with TBI and available resources. So Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll try to move the slides as you prefer.
Great, thank you. All right, so we wanted to start off with sort of what we call brain injury 101, so that you actually have an understanding of what it is that we're referring to. So we talk about the term acquired brain injury. That is in of itself an umbrella term that includes traumatic brain injury that we're focusing primarily on today, as well as non-traumatic brain injury. So the formal definition of traumatic brain injury is any alteration in brain function or evidence of brain pathology, so some injury to the brain itself, and this is caused by an external force. So that's really the defining difference between a traumatic brain injury and a non-traumatic, is the caused by an external force. So a non-traumatic brain injury is also a brain injury and can be as serious. And some examples may include anoxia. So examples of that would be attempted strangulation in women survivors of intimate partner violence, near drowning. And I won't go through, the full list here, other than to say that the TBI stands for traumatic, and ABI is the umbrella term that encompasses both. Next slide, please. So under this umbrella of traumatic brain injury, we include mild traumatic brain injury and concussion. And this is extremely important because many of the individuals that you work with may certainly have sustained a moderate or severe brain injury, but many of them will have had mild brain injury. And in fact, many of you in your own lives may have either had a concussion or know someone who's had a concussion. A concussion is a brain injury. It is a traumatic brain injury. So it is what we refer to as a complex pathophysiological process. So what that means is that pathology means something that shouldn't be there, and it is a process that affects the brain as a result of biomechanical forces. So what we mean by that is it's physics. So it's moving, it is something that causes either the head to move and the brain to move inside the head. Inside the skull, you see that picture, there's actually a lot of bony prominences inside the skull. So when the person is either hit, assaulted, falls, is involved in a car crash, the head typically moves and the brain rocks inside the skull and can hit the bony prominences inside the skull and cause an injury. The movement of the brain itself can also cause shearing and tearing of the nerve fibers. The reason we emphasize this is that a concussion, as I said, is a brain injury. Most of the time people will recover from a first ever concussion, but concussions can be cumulative and people can go on to experience long-term symptoms as a result of a concussion. Next slide, please. So how do we know that someone might have had a concussion or mild traumatic brain injury? There are a number of formal indicators. First of all, any period of loss of consciousness. So this can even include being slightly dazed or feeling confused. That is an actual alteration in consciousness. People often will lose memory for events immediately before or even after the accident or injury. Any alteration in mental state, so again, that feeling dazed, disoriented. If the individual loses consciousness for more than 30 minutes, then that is considered to be a more serious brain injury. And then we also look at something called post-traumatic amnesia. And that is the ability for an individual to actually lay down new memories following the injury. So all of those things are indicative of injury severity. So as I said, the majority of concussions, particularly first time, will resolve in 1 to 3 months. But we do know that many people, and particularly children and youth, will continue to be symptomatic at 3 months. And there are also a number of risk factors for persistent symptoms. We know that female sex are more susceptible to persistent symptoms, children, youth, and older adults. History of previous concussions. So as I mentioned earlier, concussions are cumulative. All brain injuries are cumulative. People with sleep disorders, migraines, and pre-injury history of learning disability and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Next slide, please. So a few other things that are very important, particularly for the clients that you work with, is traumatic brain injury is a disease process. Many people look at brain injury as a one-off event, and as I said earlier, yes, most people with a one-off concussion will recover fully, but multiple concussions, multiple injuries, and moderate severe injuries meet the World Health Organization criteria for a chronic disease. So what that means is that people are not cured from their brain injury, contrary to what some people might think, and it does have chronic and evolving neurological consequences across the lifespan. So we emphasize this because policymakers, funding sources, healthcare, insurance providers, justice sector, everyone needs to acknowledge that brain injury is a chronic, lifelong health condition, and it needs to be treated as such. Next slide, please. So there are a number of symptoms that can result from brain injury, and we use the word symptom, but I prefer to actually use the term sequelae because a symptom is something that typically can be treated. So sequelae or symptoms can result in cognitive, so thinking challenges, behavioral challenges, physical challenges, and emotional challenges to an individual. And under the realm of cognitive, we include communication. What's also very challenging for many of the clients that we all work with is that traumatic brain injury and most brain injuries are an invisible disability. There are no obvious outward signs of the disability, and so the issues or symptoms that we see are often inferred to be a character trait or as a result of other illness, and in many cases are often misinterpreted as mental health or misuse of substances. Next slide, please. So my particular focus is on cognition, communication, and behavior. So as I mentioned earlier, I look at cognitive communication as well as social cognition and social communication. They all fall under the same umbrella. So we spoke about the fact that these cognitive communication, pardon me, emotional behavioral challenges, pardon me, I just need to take a sip of water, are risk factors for justice involvement. They also significantly complicate management during the incarceration process, and they certainly create barriers to successful community reintegration. So what are these? So the underlying cognitive challenges that we typically see are difficulties with paying attention, so very short attention span, difficulty focusing on one thing for a long period of time, and really very significant difficulty in functioning in environments where there's lots of different things that could be pulling at attention. Challenges with memory, multitasking, so again, being able to do more than one thing at one time. Self-monitoring is a big one. So I'm working hard to self-monitor. I'm trying to monitor the passage of time. I'm looking at Flora's face here as we go through. So this is very difficult for people with brain injuries to do. And as a result, they're often not aware of their behaviors or their communication. Difficulty with planning and organization. So you can imagine, I mean, Flora is going to speak to you about bail conditions, etc. You can imagine for someone trying to plan and organize to even get to a bail hearing with these types of challenges. Difficulty with problem solving and reasoning. I'd also add that this doesn't necessarily mean that people with brain injuries are less intelligent, but they have functional challenges that make it very difficult for them to function in day-to-day life. We also see emotional challenges. We often see two ends of the spectrum. First, we may see someone who is very emotionally labile, meaning they can go from hysterical laughter to aggression and anger in a very short window. Or on the opposite end, we see people who, again, and this depends on the type of injury, may have a very flat affect, limited facial expression, reduced initiation, and a very flat voice. We also see difficulty with facial emotion recognition. This is important, and I'll speak to you more about these as we go through. Something called alexithymia, which is lack of emotion vocabulary and lack of the ability to recognize emotion in one's body, aggression, as well as high prevalence of depression and anxiety. And then finally, we refer to cognitive communication, which you're all using right in this moment to participate in this webinar. So this is any aspect of communication, listening, which includes not just hearing, but understanding, speaking, which involves not just me being able to move my tongue and my lips and teeth, it also involves the content, reading, writing, and thinking, because we use language to think. So this also includes challenges with behavioral self-regulation that impact social communication. Next slide, please. So what happens is that we see an intersection of all of these challenges as a result of the brain injury. And if you take a look at this diagram here, it really shows that they all work in concert. So if I'm having difficulty with attention, and memory, I may actually forget what we're talking about. I may go off on a tangent. You may redirect me, so I might lash out. I might have heightened emotion. I may also feel highly anxious and depressed about that. If someone says something to me that I interpret the wrong way, I might have difficulty with impulse control and behavioral self-regulation. So all of these things occur simultaneously and result in people having significant challenges, as I mentioned, in day-to-day life, but also in navigating the justice system. Next slide, please. So why is this important? Well, this is hugely important because verbal communication is, in essence, the primary interface for the whole justice system. And this is a wonderful quote from Ian Lambie of New Zealand. Verbal communication is the primary interface with the justice system in almost every jurisdiction. So from the moment someone is apprehended or questioned by the police to being in court, and then during the incarceration, bail hearings, and then community reintegration and working with probation and parole officers. So if anyone has any communication challenges, cognitive challenges, language difficulties, and hearing, that's another one that's really important. This actually has very significant implications for the individual's basic rights and ability to fully access and participate in the justice system. Next slide, please. So Flora and I had the privilege of doing some research a number of years ago where we interviewed, or I interviewed as part of this research program, a number of adults, some of them may have been referred by people here today, who had histories of traumatic brain injury and criminal justice system involvement. And we met with them and we examined their self-reported cognitive and communication challenges and what their experiences of communication difficulties were in different conditions. And we compared those to people with brain injuries without history of criminal justice involvement, as well as people with no brain injuries. So you can see here, the blue bar are the people with criminal justice involvement and brain injury. The orange is brain injury only, and the gray is history of neither. And we looked at a number of different areas, but one, we looked at the quality of their communication. So that means were people able to understand them? Were they able to express themselves the way they wanted to? So you can see that across that the people with brain injuries had the same amount of challenges as people with brain injury in the criminal justice sector, and it really was a significant challenge. Number two was the quantity. We know that people with brain injuries either talk too much or they talk too little. So that was even greater a challenge for our group, the justice and brain injury group, than even the brain injury group. The next was what we refer to as manner. So we all know how to change the manner of our communication in response to the context. In professional situations, we speak differently than we are maybe with our partner at home or with our children or our friends. So people with brain injuries really have difficulty in switching that, and the justice involved group had much more difficulty. And then finally, we look at what's called relation. An example of this is following conversations in noisy environments. Example, a police station, a courthouse, a jail, etc. The people with justice involvement and brain injuries, again, had very significant challenges. And in 3 of the 4 areas, their difficulties were greater than even those with just a brain injury. So we think this is very important information for everyone here to consider. Next slide, please. So we spoke a little bit about emotional dysregulation. So the people that go from hysterical laughter to verbal aggression. So we know that this is quite prominent following brain injury, and they can be very difficult and challenging to treat, and they can become chronic problems for people with brain injury. So they also have very significant adverse impacts on psychosocial functioning. We know for the most part, as our frontal lobes develop, how to control our emotions and our behavior. We use self-talk, we use self-monitoring, but for people with brain injuries, it impacts their relationships, their community reintegration, their quality of life, and it often leads to recidivism because of increased anger and aggression, difficulty maintaining, meeting typical social norms that are expected both in the justice system as well as in community. So we know that people with brain injuries have a lot of difficulty in processing emotion. Next slide, please. So we can look at this, and if we look at people's faces, we'd have a pretty good idea of what these individuals were feeling. Now, sometimes, you know, we also look to context, we listen to the voice as well, but the first thing that people without brain injuries do in facial scanning is we look at people's eyes, and then we look at their mouth. So we know that people with brain injuries don't scan in that efficient way, and that they really don't pick up on emotion expression in someone's faces, and they often misinterpret it, so they get into difficulty. You know, perhaps a male with a brain injury or a female with a brain injury, you know, is misinterpreting something from someone of the opposite sex or the same sex in a relationship, and they don't understand that it's a no. They may not pick up that someone is angry and maybe about to punch them. So this can lead to a lot of difficulty. Next slide, please. I mentioned alexithymia, and this is present in 30 to 61% of people with brain injuries compared to 10% in a non-TBI population. So as I mentioned, this means poor awareness for personal emotions, so lack of emotion recognition in oneself, as well as emotion recognition of others. Reduced acknowledgement of physical sensations. This is important. Many people with brain injuries have anxiety, but they may not make the connection that an increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, flushing, that may be signaling to them that they're upset and they may not be able to act on it. The other thing is that they have difficulty describing or distinguishing emotions, differentiating anger from sad, and they often tend to be concrete in their thinking. Next slide, please. So finally, we see something that we refer to as negative attribution. So some people, in addition to alexithymia, they interpret every behavioral intent or most behavioral intents from another person as negative. So I might be, again, looking at Flora, Flora's looking at me, and I might see her and I think, oh gosh, she's mad at me, or she's out to get me, even though her intent may be nothing of the sort. So they misinterpret another's intent as being negative, even when it isn't. So when you combine this with behavioral dysregulation, meaning poor impulse control, that puts people in a lot of difficulty and can play out as being both a risk factor for involvement in the justice system, as well as recidivism. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Flora to continue with our next learning objective.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm going to walk you through some research. It's certainly not all of the research, but it's part of the research around prevalence of TBI in the criminal justice system, and also around conditions of release, something that we're focusing on in the Justice and Equity Lab at this point in time. So Catherine's already talked about why it's important to consider TBI in the context of the criminal justice system. Interactions with police and frontline workers, probation, parole officers, and formal hearings, as she suggested, involves complex social interactions that require high level and fast-paced processing for information, understanding, and responding. And I've been in the courtroom, and I know that it is fast-paced, and I have trouble with the jargon and the language myself at times. So I think, if someone with a TBI who is challenged with some of the cognition and communication, the challenges that Catherine just spoke about, it's going to be very difficult for them to understand what's happening. And we know from some research that people will agree to things in the courtroom who may have a TBI because they really just do not understand what's happening and just want to get things done with. And then they agree to things where they may say they are guilty. And so I think, it's really important for us to be aware of the challenges that people face and how that may affect their interactions with the criminal justice system. Wasalik and Turkstra talk about impairments in working memory and speed of processing. So in fast-paced environments, it's really hard to comprehend what's happening. Memory deficits, as well as increased anger, impulsivity, and irritability, create a lot of challenges for people involved with the criminal justice system. So one of the things to consider when you're working with clients in the criminal justice system and supporting them is that many of the people that you see will have a traumatic brain injury. The prevalence ranges, for people in prison, ranges from 36% to almost 90%. So consider that when you're sitting in front of a client or you have a client in a courtroom, that they probably have a traumatic brain injury and are dealing with the challenges resulting from that injury. We also know that injury counts are underestimated. Early life injuries, people may not even be aware of them. There's a lot of trauma in this population, childhood and physical sexual abuse. And often people are not aware of the seriousness of their injuries as adults. We did a recent study on female sex workers around traumatic brain injury with a student of mine, and we found that many of them did not want to go to the emergency department. They did not want to talk about their injuries. The only time that they might end up there if they had a head injury, if there was blood. And then when they got there, they did not want to talk about the fact that the injury may have been a result of an assault, but that they would rather say that it was the result of drug use. So, really the stigma around, criminal justice involvement, drug use is very, very prevalent among health service providers, unfortunately. And so, people may not even go for help for their injuries. In another study, what we found was that, the reported number of TBIs among people in the prison was upwards of from 1.1 to 2.7, and the average number of symptoms could be up to 19. So that's a lot of symptoms that people are challenged with and dealing with on a daily basis. We did 2 studies out of the Justice and Equity Lab, and we looked at traumatic brain injury among a cohort of 18 to 28-year-olds, and we looked at the population of Ontario using ICES data, which is health medical records. What we found that the Ontario residents within that age cohort who had sustained a TBI were almost 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than men and women who had not sustained a TBI. So we know that people are going into the justice system with a TBI. On top of that, they have mental health concerns, and they also have substance use issues. And so a lot of people in the healthcare system or the criminal justice system are really there because of health concerns and health needs. I am getting some feedback, just so I'm not sure if anyone else is. We also did another study with adult men and women from age 18 and over, and we looked to see if people with TBI had incurred more in-prison serious disciplinary charges than people without TBI. And what we found was they were 39 times more likely to incur an in-prison serious disciplinary charge. So that can affect their time in prison. It may extend it. It also may force them into segregation. So something to consider as well. I spoke earlier about adverse life experiences. They're common among people with traumatic brain injury and who are incarcerated. This is particularly prevalent for criminalized women. We also know that 75% of women survivors of IPV are living with probable TBI, and many women survivors of IPV also have interactions with the criminal justice system. We also know that women inmates who are convicted of a violent crime are more likely to have sustained a TBI prior to that crime, or they've sustained some other form of physical abuse. And we also know there's a higher risk of recidivism if you've had a TBI. And one study suggests that it's up to 69% higher for those with TBI. And I think Catherine may have mentioned this before, but the prevalence rates are so significant that the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have identified TBI among prisons and jails as a significant public health problem. So it really is a health problem. It's not, and it becomes a criminal justice problem because we are steering people with health issues into the criminal justice system and expecting that they will get support there. But the health support is it's not what they need. We also know there are misconceptions of TBI, and today we're here because you've asked us to come and present about this issue so that you have more understanding of what's happening around TBI in the criminal justice system. If you think about some of the things that Catherine was talking about in terms of the challenges that people face, TBI, if you are impulsive or you're aggressive or you can't retain information, then this can be misinterpreted as noncompliance, rudeness, defiance, poor motivation, disengagement, and aggression, and all not good things in the criminal justice system to be considered in terms of, how is a person reacting to say a correctional officer or a probation parole officer or a police officer. It can get them in greater trouble, so to speak. So there is evidence that there's limited awareness and common misperceptions of TBI prevalence itself, which is about 80%, as I said, and challenges among supervision officers who may contribute to this may contribute to poor supervision outcomes. So something, again, to keep in mind. So recently we've been refocusing a bit on court-mandated conditions, supervision conditions, and traumatic brain injury. One of the reasons is I'll talk to you about a network that we've developed at Unity Health that's called Breaking the Cycle Network, and the network is focusing more and more on these conditions of release. So let me just talk you through some of this research. We know that individuals in Canada under court-mandated supervision conditions, that the the number on those supervision conditions exceeds the number in custody. So we have more people in the community under supervision than we do in custody. And the rate of adults under community supervision in the provinces and territories was 321 adults per 100,000 population. So like 70% more adults on remand daily than in the sentence custody in the provinces and the territories. So really a focus on those conditions of supervision and how people are managing those conditions of supervision, especially if they are challenged, if they're experiencing challenges with traumatic brain injury. So what are the challenges for people who have conditions of supervision? So most people released from custody have bail, probation, or parole conditions. They must be followed. These can pose significant challenges. For example, orders to avoid particular people and places can reduce access to vital social support networks and services. Orders to abstain from drugs and alcohol can prove challenging for those with a history of substance use. If one has a criminal record, it can be difficult to abide by orders to find employment. So the conditions and the context in which they're set can create challenges for people. And then, as I said, add other complex factors on that: traumatic brain injury, financial and housing instability, mental health issues, and substance use issues, and the prospects of successfully reentering society and staying out of prison can be grim. TBI history is associated with a greater risk of behavioral infractions, treatment non-adherence, failure to appear for mandatory appointments, probation and parole violations, and revocations. So a really difficult environment for people with traumatic brain injury to navigate and around those conditions of supervision. Qualitative research on experiences of justice-involved persons with a history of TBI is rare, and there's even less research considering gender differences. And we might be able to imagine how it might, conditions of supervision may differ for men and women, and for people of different sexual orientation. Women still play for a large part the child looking after children, and men not so much. So what does it mean if someone is under some conditions and they can't go certain places for women that their children may go, and how do they manage those that navigate that relationship and that context? To date, there's been no everyday interaction studies on everyday interactions, perspectives, and practices among control agents and supervised subjects related to managing conditions in the context of TBI. There's been some studies on court-mandated supervision conditions, but very, very few on those include people with traumatic brain injury. So let me see if I can get this to play. I'm not sure I can because I couldn't get it on. No, it's not going to play. I'm going to stop sharing for one moment. And then, oh, there it is. Okay. Can you still see my screen?
We can see you. We can't see the screen.
Okay. Let me go back to share screen. And please tell me if the sound is okay.
A city's health is measured by the well-being of all who live there. As cities grow, the need to reduce health inequalities becomes more urgent.
The video is not playing. The sound is playing, but the video itself is not playing. Okay. Do you have the website open? Did you want to just go to the website?
It would take me a few minutes to find it. So why don't I just forgo that, okay? So I was going to show you a video. It's quite a lovely video. Let me give you some context for this. Back in March 2020, just before we went into lockdown and everybody went home, MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions and the St. Michael's Hospital Foundation put together a symposium for 10 solutions networks that were funded through the foundation and supported by MAP. These solutions networks were created to build a network of people, policy people, scientists, researchers, community members to develop solutions for particular populations. 10 were selected out of a group of several applications, and we were lucky that the Breaking the Cycle Solution Network was accepted and supported. And so this is a video that shows that. I'll include the URL when we send out the presentation, so you'll have it and you can take a look at it. But it's sorry. So we developed this Breaking the Cycle network to try to help people as they're released from custody. So that was our original intent. These are the current members of the Breaking the Cycle network. We're always happy to have new members. So if you're interested, please reach out. I'm happy to talk to you about it. But we really wanted to help people as they're released from custody to have a better reentry experience, to support them during reentry. And as over the next 2 years, we refined the focus of the project, and what we wanted to kind of situate ourselves in is around traumatic brain injury. So people with traumatic brain injury and trying to manage those conditions of release. So so that's the refined focus of the network, and we are building this solution together. And we're working with our partners. We're going to design, develop, and launch. Right now, we're thinking of launching a mobile health app. We're going to think that through some more. There may be a mobile health app piece to it, as well as a hard copy to help people as they are released from custody, those with TBI, how they manage those court-mandated conditions of release, or conditions of supervision. And we've been very lucky that we've been funded through donors through the St. Michael's Hospital Foundation, and just recently through a grant through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. We're really interested in talking to people with experience under conditions, but also those who set and monitor conditions. And so we'll be reaching out to the HSJCC network over the next few months. And just so you know, Katie Almond is one of the key knowledge users on this project and has been doing a lot of work to help us try to figure out our recruitment strategy, as well as the other network members. So if you're interested, please get in touch. And so, yeah, so I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine, and she's going to talk about our last learning objective.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Flora. So we really wanted to wrap this up by giving you some tools to support your clients. So before I even get into cognitive communication challenges, I would like to reinforce the most important thing is to ask the question. You know, Flora said that, you know, based on the prevalence, we know that it's highly likely that if you're working with a client that they have had a history of brain injury. Make the assumption that they have one rather than not, but ask the question. There are also a number of screening tools available, but just even ask, you know, have you ever hit your head? Have you had a blow to the head or the body? Where you felt dizzy or sick to your stomach. You don't have to lose consciousness in order to have a brain injury. So I think the first thing is to ask the questions. Secondly, in order to support cognitive communication challenges, may I also begin before jumping into these points here by saying, if you're supporting someone who has to be in court, please reach out to the accessibility coordinator We're also supporting a designated accessibility coordinator for the new Toronto courthouse, because communication should be accessible to all people. It is actually legislated both nationally and provincially. But what are the things that you specifically can do when you're working with your clients? So we spoke about the fact that they're highly distractible. They may also have sensory challenges where they're bothered by bright lights, loud sounds. So wherever you can, work in a quiet room with limited distractions. Speak a bit more slowly than you might normally and use shorter sentences. Now that's challenging, I realize, for many people to do. I was aware as I was speaking earlier that I was actually speaking much more quickly than I typically would, because we have a lot to pack into this very short session. But where you can, slow down, pause, and use shorter sentences. Pause in between so that they can process. The other thing is we need to ask about hearing. There are two types of issues that we see. Number one is an actual hearing loss. The other is what we call central auditory processing disorder, which means the person might have difficulty picking out speech in background noise. So you can imagine in noisy environments that's even more challenging. They might have difficulty with ringing in the ears that we call tinnitus or tinnitus. All of these things are absolutely exhausting. And then if you add on difficulty with attention, so quiet environments are best. The other thing is let your client know that it's a safe space and they can ask for repetition or clarification at any time. Provide a brief summary of the main points after each section of the conversation. Ask your client to tell you what they understand. You remember when Flora said, many people will literally sit there and nod and agree if, the judge or someone is saying something because they cannot follow and they're so embarrassed and they're exhausted, and so they say yes. So do not say, do you understand? Because when people say that, the other person is going to nod and say, yes, I do, even when they don't understand. So tell me what you understood. Can you share with me what we were just talking about? And if you get it wrong, no problem, we'll fill in the blanks. And that's why the notes can be very helpful. The other thing is setting up realistic reminder strategies. I imagine that might be part of the app that Flora is developing, but either way, help if the person has a phone, help to put in appointments in the phone. If you're in a position to call the person, don't call them the morning of their bail hearing, or try not to. If you can, call them the day before. Do you have your TTC route? Do you know how much time you need? Have you got the time you need to leave your home? Do you have all of the forms that they need? So it's wherever you can, providing the organization and the scaffolding. So those are some examples of supporting cognitive communication challenges. Next slide, please. So we also developed a referral network in some previous research that Flora and I were doing together, funded by the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation. We recognize that many individuals in the justice system may not have a formally diagnosed brain injury, and that's a real problem because having a formal diagnosis is the only way to access any OHIP-funded care. Now, that doesn't mean that there's lots of OHIP funded care. There isn't, except in the acute stage. In the chronic stage, it's pretty much non-existent. However, we were working with the John Howard Society of Toronto, but any organization. So there's two streams. So if the person does have a diagnosed brain injury, you can refer them directly to the Toronto ABI network. Now, this is for those, I realize there may be some from outside Toronto who are on this webinar today, but specifically for the Toronto area. So the Toronto ABI network is the gatekeeper for all OHIP funded adult 18 and over brain injury services. The link for the ABI network is in the MAP Health, and I believe we put it in the resource section. The other thing with the ABI network is that the local health integrated network, the LIN navigator, each LIN has an ABI navigator. So the Central Toronto LIN navigator also works with the ABI network. So they will, again, try to get the person into brain injury, OHIP-funded brain injury services. Now, if the person does not have a diagnosis, we've been working with the Toronto Inner City Family Health Team, and they have agreed to take referrals of individuals with suspected brain injury and with history taking and formal examination. They will provide a retrospective diagnosis, which means that people then can get into the system for OHIP-funded supports. Now, we also wanted to, we'll talk more about community resources. We strongly suggest that you take a look at the website for the Brain Injury Society of Toronto, as well as the Ontario Brain Injury Association. I will also speak to you about the Compassionate Justice Fund. There are a lot of really excellent community-based resources, and they're very used to working with individuals who intersect with the justice system and brain injuries. So if you have a client with a diagnosed or suspected brain injury, we strongly recommend that you take advantage of these resources. Next slide, please. So this essentially explained what I just spoke about. So this is kind of a way to walk you through. You'll note on the bottom where it says referral to Toronto ABI Network. Julie Osbelt is the Central LIN ABI navigator. She's wonderful. She works closely with us. We've put the information and for the Inner City Family Health Team and the ABI Network. Everything is on this particular slide. Next slide, please. So the Brain Injury Society of Toronto, Melissa Vigar is the executive director. We both work very closely with her. She's just an absolute force of nature, and they do really incredible work. So they provide programs and services to people living with an ABI, so it doesn't have to be a traumatic brain injury. They do not need a diagnosis, their families as well as their caregivers. So even for you as a frontline staff, you can also reach out to BIST for short, OBIA, as well as to the Compassionate Justice Fund for help. So the overall mission is to enhance the quality of life of people living in the city of Toronto through advocacy, awareness, education, and support. Next slide, please. So these are some of the types of supports that they provide: securing identification, obtaining medical services, completing income support applications, navigating ODSP, Ontario Works. It is so difficult for a person with a brain injury to navigate all the forms needed to fill out for ODSP. It is absolutely ridiculous. It's not the least bit accessible. So all of these types of things they can support the individual with. Next slide, please. So I'm excited to tell you a little bit about the Compassionate Justice Fund. This is a nonprofit organization that launched officially in 2021, just over a year and a half ago, in partnership with the Ontario Brain Injury Association. And the aim was to bridge a critical gap in funding for rehabilitation services with people with traumatic brain injury from underserved communities. The majority of people that you work with will never have had any rehabilitation for their brain injuries whatsoever, or if they have, it certainly was minimal. Again, a formal diagnosis is not necessary. What we do is we provide real-world, on-the-ground solutions, including providing rehabilitation therapies. We do some case coordination and support, as well as even providing technology access devices for people across Ontario age 16 and older. So you can apply for an individual, or they can apply themselves. There are two application forms on our website. We currently have 2 funding rounds per year. We're aiming to increase that as we grow, but our next funding cycle is open until May 30th, and then funding will begin in June. So we have provided anywhere from $500–600 to pay for a tablet for people in rural locations to access remote therapies and services, all the way to $2,000 to pay for things like psychotherapy, physiotherapy. We've even supported an intimate partner violence survivor who is on the run with first month's rent. So we really, we're trying to bridge a very critical gap. We do have a number of our clients who are currently or have been incarcerated. We currently have 2 clients who are incarcerated. Not surprisingly, all of our clients have mental health challenges. Almost everyone has experienced violence, abuse, and precarious housing. We will take an emergency application on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, the IPV survivor who was on the run and needed that rent, we processed that right away. We also refer to and work closely with partner organizations. So we do welcome referrals. You're very welcome to refer your clients, and the website is linked on another one of the slides. Next slide, please. Oh, and Katie Allman is also on our steering committee. So in terms of another fabulous resource, the Brain Injury Society of Toronto has developed an ABI Justice web-based toolkit. I was involved in developing some of the materials for that. There's 2 sections. One is for people with lived experience. There is another section for justice professionals. It has everything on there from information, forms that can be completed and downloaded, resources, etc. So again, I strongly encourage you to take a look at that website. Here is also the link for the Compassionate Justice Fund, and I invite you to take some time to look at our website. Next slide, please. So thank you. I think we've done pretty well in terms of the time. I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes. We welcome any questions, and thank you again for your attention today.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Flora. So your presentation was incredibly thorough, and it answered many of the questions in the chat box. There are a couple. One is, can overdose on drugs cause brain injury?
Yes. Yes, it can.
And it's cumulative, so I guess many overdoses would create quite an issue.
Well, I think it depends on, that's not a concrete yes or no. It would depend on the amount, what the substance was, but the bottom line would be most likely. Yeah.
And another question, prisoners are not OHIP funded. So
no, they're not.
So how do they get support while incarcerated?
So that's a big challenge. I would suggest reaching out to your ABI LIN navigator. I would suggest speaking with, if the person has a lawyer, you can reach out to the Compassionate Justice Fund, depending on what the needs are. We know that many times brain injuries occur while people are incarcerated and they're not always receiving medical attention. So that's a big issue. It's also important to lobby for prisoners to be funded under OHIP. But yeah, so I would reach out to the local ABI LIN navigator, the lawyer, and the local Brain Injury Association if it's not Toronto.
Thank you. Thank you both, Flora and Catherine, for being with us. It's really incredible how many of the vulnerable people that we work with every day have brain injuries. So thank you for, sharing strategies on how to better understand them and better deal with them. We appreciate it. Thank you to individuals that have posted links in the chat, and also the brain injury screening tool. Thank you to Judith. A reminder to everybody that there's the evaluation in the chat. If you have a minute before you log off, just to fill it out, that would help us incredibly. And also the PowerPoint will be shared with everybody who registered today, and will also be posted on our HSJCC website. So again, Catherine, Flora, your presentation was wonderful, and we thank you so very much for sharing the information that will help us to better help the people that we deal with every day.
You're most welcome. I think we can do our best service when we all work collaboratively together. So this is a team. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who's joined us here today. If you do have any questions that haven't been answered, if you'd like to email them to Domenica, we'll do the best we can to get the answer for you.
Our emails our direct emails are on the very last slide, so you will have them as well. You're most welcome to reach out to me directly. And I'm sure Flora too, but I can't speak for Flora.
Yes, me as well. And also all the references for the research are included in the slides as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you again. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.